Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Under state constitutions, all state governments must convene not later than 6 months from their last sitting. Now, for some assemblies, that date expires either this month or in May. Now, the MCO, it seems, has posed an unforeseen constitutional dilemma for state governments. Should state assemblies still meet, regardless of the MCO? Joining us on the line now to give a better understanding of the situation, we have former law professor Gurdial Singh Nijar, president of the National Human Rights Society, or better known as HAKAM. Gurdial, good evening. Thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Hello.
You know, you've been quoted as saying that state assemblies must continue to hold their meetings or risk undermining the role of separation of powers and, in fact, the entire democratic process. Now, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. What did you mean by that?
Well, the provision in the federal constitution is very clear. It requires the convening of a meeting within 6 months from the last session. And that's a federal edict, if you call it that, and therefore it has to be adhered to. There is no extenuating circumstance that is written into the Constitution excusing or allowing for the delay of this particular provision. In other words, this provision is mandatory, it has to be complied with, and if it is not complied with, then it's a violation of the Constitution.
So just to get this right, this is under the federal constitution as well as state constitutions, right?
Yes, the federal constitution, there's Article 55, which requires that. But there's also a provision in the federal constitution which says that all state constitutions must include in their state constitution certain provisions. And this is one of the provision which is mandatory also for state constitutions to incorporate in their state constitutions. So all state constitutions have this provision.
Okay.
Could you explain to us why this is so? I mean, why shouldn't the executive be allowed to negotiate the question of the sitting, whether it's a federal parliament or state assemblies?
Well, generally speaking, you can prorogue, which means you can adjourn or have a complete adjournment of the proceedings itself. All right, you can adjourn or you can prorogue, discontinue. But there is a requirement that there cannot be more than 6 months from the last session sitting. Now, there is a reason for that, because the government must always allow for the legislature, the legislative assembly, because these are the people's representatives who have been voted, and they must have all issues that need to be discussed by the legislature itself, and then they can decide on the passing of any resolutions or the discussion of any bills or acts that the Parliament wants to introduce in the Dewan Rakyat.
Okay.
So this is a very critical part, of the separation of powers between the government and the legislator. And it's also a critical part of allowing as a foundation of parliamentary government, to allow people's representatives to discuss issues that are critical to the nation. And you cannot just simply allow the executive, the government, to keep postponing this and defeat this whole foundational basis of a democracy.
Well, Gurdial, isn't the MCO, isn't the Movement Control Order enough to postpone any sittings outside the 6-month date?
My short answer is that it is not a good enough reason unless there is a calamity of a major proportion which prevents the convening of a meeting. Now, the convening MCO cannot be used as a basis to defer the convening of the meeting in the light of this mandatory provision, because if you do that, then you can keep postponing the discussion of matters that require national attention through the representatives of the people itself who have voted them in. So, in short, you cannot postpone unless it is impossible to convene. Now, here, it is not impossible to convene. How you best deal with it, of course, it will depend upon how the House and the Speaker can arrange for something that is not hazardous and will provide for an accommodation of the infectious disease spreading problem.
Gurdial, one of the things, of course, is that around the discussion of the MCO is the discourse of, of a crisis, right? That this is a war. And, there is, in fact, kind of subtle references to warlike situations where we imagine, many basic rights can be suspended. Think of the Constitution being suspended because of the war. Is this pandemic analogous to a war situation which would result in the Constitution being somehow held in abeyance in order to resolve the warlike situation?
Well, the word war has been used, but there is no war as such that disallows the exercise of the fundamental freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution and for provisions of the Constitution to be implemented. So it is a figurative, this is a figure of speech that it is a war and therefore it requires measures. But unless you can show that the country is is disabled to the extent that it cannot function at all unless you have a special operational government executive to run the process, then you have to allow the constitutional provisions to continue to apply. In other words, whatever you do to deal with this pandemic, which is, of course, unusual, has to be done consistently with the provisions of the Constitution.
Okay. All right. So you're saying there really is no excuse not to have a parliament sitting or for state assemblies to meet. So how would that look like in the era of physical and social distancing, Gurdial, in the 1 minute that we have left?
Yes. You see, you look at other countries, Singapore, for example. Now, what they've done is they have put in place, so the first reading was on 7th of April. They put in place COVID-19 temporary measures bill, in which they actually provide that where meetings have to be convened and which require personal attendance, as Parliament and the state assemblies require, then there are various ways in which you can deal with it electronically. You can ask questions through electronic means. You can have those answered. Even voting can be done through the electronic media.
Right.
So the fact is that you can make provisions to accommodate, but you have to anchor this in legal provisions if you want to avoid violating the Constitution itself. You cannot just announce over the radio that this is going to happen or we are going to defer Parliament or state assemblies because that is what the executive feels. They can't do that because of the mandatory provision in the Constitution itself, which requires you to convene a meeting, which means convene a meeting which requires the members of Parliament or the aduns to actually physically attend, unless there's a provision that's made to the contrary. And so far, we have not done what Singapore has done to provide for this alternative means of conducting meetings.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show for this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with Sharaad Kuttan signing off. Thank you so much for watching and good night.